Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. Thank you for joining the inaugural FinOps webinar. In this case, we're talking about FinOps best practices in the most general sense, and we'll see that as we step through today's presentation. Quick introduction for me. My name is Jonathan Lawrence. I work in Flexera's FinOps advisory team. We're a global team, but we do have regional presence as well. And my responsibility is for really combining the people, tools, and process in the best way possible, wrapped around the FinOps Foundation and FinOps best practice to deliver IT financial management value. So that covers quite a broad scope, but the important thing to understand, and we'll see this as we go through today's session, that it isn't just about a tool or just about numbers. People and process are equally important as getting the numbers out of your cloud service providers or wherever they come from and dealing with them. So today's agenda is going to look a little bit like this. Oh, excuse me, I missed, there we go. First technology problem, so I missed the slide. Here's the slide, that is me. You've heard about me. The next area was importantly to cover the agenda. So the agenda for today is going to be broken down into these topics. The reason the last two are just highlighted in orange, it depends on how our time goes. If we get any questions in the chat, we may want to divert into a particular area of interest, which means that we'll leave these for later sessions. So for today, we are, as I say, taking our first step in terms of delivering a series of these. So what we hope to do is bring you content, but the content is really up to you. So we would like to hear from you. Engagement is what's important to us. So if you tell us the themes that you'd like to explore in future sessions, we're really open to that. Probably would like to steer away from specifics. We can get into those in the sessions, but to steer us on a course for the future, feel free to feedback in the chat or directly to me. My contact details are in the links, and we will endeavor to answer your questions at a time that's appropriate as we go through these sessions. And of course, today, feel free to post any questions in the chat. I have colleagues who should be joining the call who'll be able to answer those. We'll take some breaks through the session as well, just to stop and take a look at any that might have arrived. Okay, so really we need to start at the beginning, and starting at the beginning means starting with why do we actually need FinOps? What are the questions that are being asked by the business which has made FinOps even a thing? And typically what we find is it starts with a question, typically from senior leadership, which is, we're spending too much in cloud. So probably worth a preamble at this point, I think. 15 years ago, 20 years ago in some cases, there was a strong push toward cloud as cloud companies emerged, and the innovation and the benefits emerged from that. Actually, the flexibility and the agility were quite a hard sell. The idea that you could save CapEx cost and reduce potentially your expenditure for the same IT services by moving them to cloud was a much easier story to sell. And the systems integrators around the world and many consulting companies did a great job of that. So there was a big move, and you're probably part of it. Some people are well in or all in the cloud, but many are still kind of toe dipping or moving their way gradually into the cloud. And we need to address everybody through these sessions. So take a breath if you're already in the cloud and cloud native. If you're making that journey, then listen closely. So we get questions like, we're spending too much in the cloud. And then the usual answer from technology leadership is, to their reports, is, why are we spending so much in the cloud? And typically what the answer is to that is, We don't know because there's no single group that has oversight. So really, it needs to start with some questions. So if you're the FinOps person responsible for cloud cost in your organization, it's really getting an understanding of, from a leadership perspective, what the importance is. Is it actually a reduction in cloud spend, or is it to understand what's being spent, how it's being spent, and does it support the initiatives of the business? Questions like this are really fundamental to FinOps because it gives us important levers as we go through our journey. And just understanding our key stakeholders is really important as well. And it really does start with the leadership in almost every case. So take time to do that. There are many people in the boardroom. Most of them, typically, you won't be interacting with on a daily basis. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't understand what's important to them. I think a useful kind of representation, and this came from the IBM Institute for Business Value, kind of shows the typical relationships and the strength of those relationships between different board members. So actually understanding that from a FinOps perspective, where you're likely sat under a CIO type role, that it isn't just a CIO talking to the chief exec. The CIO is going to be talking to the chief financial officer, maybe the CISO as well, from a compliance and risk perspective. So understanding those relationships and who's reporting there, in what time scale, and with what results is extremely important. And the reason some of this is becoming important from a cloud perspective, it's kind of an adjacent space to FinOps, but sustainability is on everybody's radar now. It's making an emergence in the compensation plans of many executives. And the relationship between IT expenditure, but cloud expenditure in particularly, and the ability to correlate that to sustainability and ESG relationships is particularly important, because cost can be used, or cloud expense can be used as an analogy for your CO2 emissions. So sort of as a proxy for those. So it does become important, and helpfully the FinOps Foundation have built out some more of those needs, and I would recommend that you use that resource, finops.org, to take a look at some of those personas in the boardroom and really get into an understanding of what makes these people tick. I've just pulled out a couple here in the boxes, and we can see things like the unpredictability of cloud and cloud spend in particular, maybe forecasts not matching expected spend, or spend not matching expected forecasts. But if you start looking down the list here of the challenges that a CEO will be really cognizant of, match in some ways as they go down through a CFO and a CTO or a CIO type function. In every case, they're looking at cost, but what they're interested in may not be directly cloud cost in its own right. What they're interested in is making sure that the cost matches the business outcomes. So there are things that we obviously need to do, and they're part of our table stakes as a FinOps practitioner. But understanding that things like the key metrics from a chief executive point of view might be different to the things that we might think that are important from a day-to-day cloud cost management perspective. So things like cost of goods sold might not really figure from a FinOps perspective, but they're really important to consider when presenting information back to the board on progress that you've made as part of your FinOps journey and all those initiatives around cloud cost management that might happen as you go forward. So what does that really mean? Let's take a look at the kind of utopia of FinOps, and that is cloud economics or unit economics, and that links to things like cost of goods sold, but it's really the relationship to the amount that's spent and the amount of value that's delivered. And as you can see from the the slide there, without FinOps, generally what you'll see is a unit cost going at in the same direction as your cloud cost. So to deliver a certain thing and support that with your cloud expense does not change. So the more units you ship, or the more customers you service, or the more web transactions you accommodate, the cost of delivering those is staying the same and increasing as you go over time. The position you want to be in is really with the right-hand side and making sure that the ability to deliver your units doesn't stay in line with your cloud costs. So your cloud costs can go up, but your unit costs will go down. So you're shipping more, but your cloud costs aren't going up in parallel to your unit costs. And if our animation is working well here, let's see if it does. Ah, great, one popping up more. So what can happen if you're doing your FinOps right is your cloud costs could be going up considerably, but your unit costs may not be going up at the same rate. And that is where we have efficiencies of cloud spend. So really important to understand that cloud costs can go up, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad thing. We're on about cloud cost optimization for the most part and cloud cost management. And in a general terms, that doesn't have to mean reducing costs. So we've got a little bit about maybe what our leadership needs and a little bit about some of the things that they will find important. But where do we start and where do we sit? We sit in the center of a number of kind of intersecting disciplines. And what we find when we start a FinOps project, and I alluded to it in the first slide, is that we're missing quite a number of things in many cases. Because it's driven by a reaction to cloud cost expenditure and perhaps unpredictability and a number of other factors. The requirement is just for a particular thing, which is loosely defined and not helpful for measuring what we should do, how we should do it, what time we should track it over, and who should be responsible. So we generally are missing, clear objectives, not just to reduce cost, but also understanding by what measure, against what, by how much, and over what period. We need some explicit mandates if we're going to take actions. The actions, in some cases, may be within our realm of responsibility, but in some cases not. And we will likely be working with groups such as a Cloud Center of Excellence, which is the CCOE denoted here, maybe with finance, maybe with procurement, to look at the way we approach and negotiate with our suppliers. And we need to understand what knowledge and education deficits there are across the organization. So not just with ourselves as practitioners, but also with other groups that are going to be helping us. And that's not just our peer groups in kind of the CCOE, finance and procurement. That's up at the top of the organization as well. And that can start with simple education plans, or it can be complex internal plans with certifications and things like that. Again, the FinOps Foundation helps us. They have a clear education plan broken down largely by persona in quite consumable chunks, but that may or may not be right for your organization. So really consider how people need to be educated and on what they need to be educated, and come up with an education and training plan that's fit for your organization. And maybe if we have a little bit of time at the end, can talk to you about some of the things that people are doing, which have resonated well with their businesses and with the users and recipients of the FinOps data. So we've got ourselves in the center, as you'd expect, and as kind of defined by the FinOps Foundation as well. So let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail. And I don't want this necessarily to be a session where I just repeat everything that's available to you all from the FinOps Foundation, but some of it is quite important, and quite important because what's of critical importance is that we understand the business value of what we're doing. And it's important that our peer personas, and those are represented by the core personas in this slide, understand that as well. And it's a team effort. As the principles state, teams need to collaborate. Decisions are driven by business value. Everyone takes ownership of their usage of cloud. Well, maybe, maybe not. We'll come to that one in a little while. FinOps data should be accessible and timely, absolutely. And a centralized team drives FinOps. And this is really what we're talking about here, the education and enablement of other teams to help FinOps overall is critical. And from an executive and buy-in perspective, quantifying the business value is some of the important levers that we have to do that. So being able to plan and estimate, really important. To be able to forecast based on experience and planning and integration into other teams to understand what the future might look like is important. Setting budgets for people so they know what they should be spending, and if they get near to or over their budget, they understand that there's an implication, important as well. And then some benchmarking. So partly leading towards a kind of gamification of FinOps to compete either with your market peers or maybe within the organization as well, to understand your position in terms of good practice. So these domains and capabilities all come with a framework. They all come with a scoring that can be loosely aligned to that from a crawl, walk and run perspective that you see down in the bottom right-hand corner. So being able to benchmark yourself in terms of progress is important. Being able to benchmark yourself in terms of objectives is also important. And then we come back to the unit economics bit. So whatever those units are, it may be cost per CPU hour, it may be an external measurement of number of users serviced or web pages serviced, or units shipped, items produced, doesn't really matter. But actually aiming towards some sort of unit measure is usually not an immediate objective, but those kind of things should be aspirational to you. And of course, the wider team, the way we interact, depending on the size of your organization, will depend largely on the actors that you are interacting with. So here we see some core personas with engineering, us as the FinOps practitioner, finance, leadership, procurement, and product teams. Some of these may be a single person, some of them may be a team. It's important to reach out and make those acquaintances and relationships and understand the skills and capabilities of all of those people. Equally, as things extend and version 2 of the FinOps Foundation framework has included these allied personas that you see center middle, ITAM, which includes all things ITAM, SaaS, hardware management, and software license management. The IT financial management community, which typically in larger organizations is made up of a technology business management function, but that could be rolled into your finance and procurement teams. And IT service management to actually get things done, the ability to communicate and use the IT service management teams to have an external view of progress made. So we can see some things from our observability, but quite often IT service management is important from a workflow perspective, particularly. And of course, we always need security, and sustainability is the emerging entrant in this world that we need to consider as well. So they fit the diagram on the right-hand side, and we'll dig into a little bit of that as we go through. So I'll just pause for a moment. I don't know if we have any questions in the chat. Doesn't look like there's anything there for a moment. So what I'd like to do next is just dig in a little bit to some of the particular areas. So I mentioned the Cloud Center of Excellence, but really all that is is a framework for the collection of activities and people that make up a journey to cloud, or a migration to cloud, or from cloud to cloud, or even a straight new deployment direct into cloud. So let's take a little look at that. Okay, hopefully the screen has updated. It seems a little bit slow my end, but I'll assume that you can see everything that I can see. I mentioned earlier in the call, in the session, that we find ourselves in a position where we've started our journey to cloud, or we've inherited a position where we're in cloud and still busy migrating things and deploying new workloads into cloud. But from a good FinOps perspective, we don't just want to know things when they've arrived in the cloud. We need that forward-looking visibility, and that comes really as part of this kind of cloud operating model template. It's pretty standard. Most consultancies and systems integrators will be using something like this model. And what you have in there is groups that are going to be developing a cloud strategy. You may have some cloud adoption teams to understand exactly how and when that's going to happen. You'll have a demand management team, so they're reaching out into the business and trying to understand what future demand there will be for services and new services. And then you've got the enterprise architecture team, turning those requirements into something that can be made real in a cloud or even a traditional IT environment. So a little bit about the migration and new deployments, obviously really important. Got a spelling mistake in there, I think, as well. But discoveries and dependencies, important. Workload deployment, obviously we need to understand what's being deployed, where it's being deployed, and our linkage as FinOps teams is to try and understand from this is what the migration strategy is, what the new deployment strategy is, and to start to influence that from a cloud cost management perspective. And we'll come on to a little bit about what those things are as we go through the session today, but just, bearing in mind that these teams, from enterprise architects down to the technology architects, generally have a habit of doing what they've done before, and that doesn't matter whether they're in-house resources or externally contracted resources. People are creatures of habit, and it's important that we have the levers to break those habits, to make sure that things that are important to cloud cost management are considered. And then we've got the operations piece on the side. So these are people that we would engage with through the life cycle. And then we've got the life cycle activities that typically support a cloud center of excellence down along the bottom. And you'll see things in there like cloud architecture guidelines. It's really important from a FinOps perspective that we start to engage, have a seat at the table, really, of all of these areas, but particularly things like enterprise architecture and cloud architecture guidelines. Setting those out is critical to make our lives easier in the future. It's all very well doing a retrospective view of what's being deployed into cloud, tutting and saying how poorly it's been deployed. Our ideal position is where we're bringing our knowledge to bear on the teams that are actually building the architectures that are going to be deployed. So they're built in a way that can make best use of the features of the cloud in a cost-effective way. You'll see I have FinOps in here as well, because we all sit as part of that. And from an operational perspective, cloud cost management and IT financial management in general is going to sit as part of the day-to-day operations team. But rather than spend the whole day on this slide, it's there for you to view. If you have any questions, please post them. Oh, here we go. There is a question. Let's just take a moment to pause. So what position in FinOps should FinOps practitioners play when the goal of the organization is more focused towards cloud adoption? Cloud cost spend is not so much for anyone to pay attention, but is growing. Good question, and hopefully I kind of answered that a little bit, if it's focused towards cloud adoption, then in a couple of slides' time, in fact, the next slide we can dig into it a little bit. So let me take that. Thank you. I'll come to that one. But what I would also say before I move on is that actually having some linkage into market planning and communications teams is really important as well, because a lot of these functions are two-way functions. They're not just disseminating information, they're ready and usually appreciate feedback and content that they can deliver. So actually, being involved in all of those areas is quite important in terms of, well, I said it earlier, but making your life easier in the future should be a main goal of yours, not to do yourself out of a job. It's always going to be there, but actually it should be around management and optimization, and not having to re-architect your whole cloud because we haven't been able to get ahead of the game and start looking at that kind of demand management and workload deployments. So taking the question that has just been raised, let me move on to this. So this is typically, and this wasn't a seeded question, by the way, so thank you very much for it, because it does help this slide a little bit, I think. I've called it a typical ideation process for new cloud workloads, but equally it could be part of a migration model as well, although there are obviously templated methods for doing that, and a whole piece of important work that sits kind of in place of the modeling in terms of understanding your relationships between different parts of an application. So all of that application dependency mapping. But what we would find is that we typically have an idea. So it's an opportunity, a market gap, something that's created a need. And then that need goes through typically a period of modeling and iterations. And then something comes out of it. So from an enterprise architecture perspective, and then a technology architecture perspective, so that could be cloud, will happen. Something will be produced, a proof of concept or a test model. That tends to be iterated until it's something that meets the needs of the original idea or concept. We move that into UAT and we do some sizing, testing of what we think that should look like. We deploy it into production and we operate it. And that's typically the method that's followed, albeit at a very high level. I appreciate that. And we get to the point where it's deployed into production without FinOps being mentioned in any of this. So, if it's a highly available application, then our SRE, site reliability and engineering or resilience engineering teams will be looking at things like availability. They may well have a cost remit as well. But what I found from experience is typically that's the initial deployment cost, not the cost over time. Doesn't take into consideration other scope creep and other sizing considerations. So actually having a seat at the table up front when the modeling has happened, ideally being informed at least when the idea is created, to start to input to those architecture and technology teams is really important, because what we don't want to do is arrive down into production where we start our FinOps effectively, and then we have to start optimizing here. Much better to coin a term from software programming and things, but shift left. We want FinOps not to be stuck down here in the operate phase. We want it to be moved as far left as we can. We'll still have work to do here always, but what we want to do, and I think hopefully this kind of answers the question, is we need to inform people that they need to consider what the use patterns are, and they need to tell us that, and that needs to be part of the architectural pattern. We need to understand those sizing predictions. We need to understand where it's being deployed, in what regions. We need to understand what platform it's going to be on, what services it's going to be supporting, what OS it's using. Is that fixed? Is that variable? Could we change things if we needed to? What are the options that we have available? And that comes into, if we're on AWS, can we use Graviton as a processor rather than Intel? Or, if we are fixed and it is a particular OS on a particular platform? Do we have things like hybrid benefit that we can leverage to reduce the cost of that OS or the DB? What term is it going to be over? Could we commit? Do we know our forecasts? Are we confident in our sizing going forward that we could commit to a term for reservations and commitments? And what's the overall life cycle? Is this service expected to last 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 4 years? Are there things that we need to consider about storage life cycles? Is it a regulated environment where we're going to have to keep storage somewhere on ice for 7, 12, 20 years? All of these sorts of considerations form part of an overall FinOps view of the world. Oh, my apologies. My screen hasn't changed. I'm so sorry. So I was talking, you would probably not have understood what I was talking about. So let me just do a quick recap. The modeling I was talking about here clearly is where, so the ideas start, we model them, we test them, and we iterate. We do some sizing and user acceptance tests, we deploy into production. So hopefully you can see that now. And hopefully the usage patterns, time of day, the last piece of me talking away will have come across and now resonate. I'm quite happy to share. I have lots of depth around these, and we'll come on to some of them in a little bit in a couple of slides' time. But for deploying into cloud, the shift left that we were talking about, I'm not really sure where my cursor sits on this. I don't seem to have a pointer, which is some of the issue, but hopefully people could feed back to me if they can see anything at all in terms of cursoring, because at the moment I can't. So what we want to do is we want to shift left. We want to make sure that the teams that are turning the idea into reality are not just turning it in from the idea into reality as part of a technical exercise, which is just architectural, whether that's at an enterprise level or a technology level, but they're considering cloud cost in all its facets, all the way through that design process. And the reason I put the project gate and release process at the top, and this applies in my experience, whether it's a small organization, a large organization, whether they're moving from on-prem to cloud or deploying a new workload or moving from cloud to cloud. There will typically be gate processes, and the gate processes are checkpoints where we can interject and start to raise questions around what is being done around cost. Why have these decisions been made? What options do we have to change that? If we changed it, what impact would that be from your design perspective? How much rework would we have to do? So some of this happens retrospectively anyway. It's something that a lot of you will, I'm sure, be familiar with, where there's decisions to be made. And perhaps it's because there's a cost initiative. Perhaps it's because the platform that you're on in the cloud has been superseded and it makes sense to move. But all of these questions kind of still come back to, where is that visibility? Do you have visibility early enough in the process? And are you able to leverage all of the things that we talked about at the start? So the skills of you and your team, the skills across the board in terms of the people that need to take the actions. So typically from our point of view, it's going to be engineering or DevOps teams, but also the people that are making decisions from a product and service perspective need to understand that there are some financial implications to the heady world of delivering new products into the market at speed. I will just take a pause there for a moment. Eve, do we have anything else? I can't see too much on the Q&A, but I'm not convinced now that my screen is showing me everything.
No other questions at the moment.
Okay, I can't hear you, Eve. I'll assume I should just move on.
No other questions at the moment.
So we've talked a little bit about what gets us to FinOps, why we might be there in terms of the the need from our executive sponsors and the fact that they want to understand cloud spend linked to business objectives. They want forecasts, they want predictability where they can, and they want to understand that there's control and budgeting, and we're taking care of the things that we're deploying into cloud, and they are all delivering value. So we've talked about a lot of things so far, but there are lots more things to talk about. And I think some of those still go back to the question that was in the chat around where the focus is on organizations that are into cloud adoption is one of the key aspects. And even if there's a FinOps practice that sits within one part of the organization, the cloud adoption piece still is something that is often relegated. I was going to say neglected, but I don't think so. Kind of relegated to a second tier of priority, but it really shouldn't be. So let's talk a little bit about what the world might look like in terms of a journey. So this is the overall kind of FinOps journey. I mean, things on here, this slide might move around. For example, I've got cloud unit economics and the value, business value of IT at the last piece, but actually it might be further up, and equally notifications in real time might be the important thing for you if your entry point into FinOps is having a lot of anomalous spend. Then actually promoting notifications in real time might, you might want that ahead of setting key performance indicators and things like that. Ultimately, you're going to get to those anyway, but let's start at the beginning. So you can read the slide as well as me, but let's go through it because it does sum up where we've got to so far, and it sums up a little bit of where we're going to go over the next few slides. So my cloud costs are higher than expected is the typical entry point, but it may be that they're not higher, but they're not going in the direction that people expect, or they're unpredictable. So FinOps is initiated. We need an executive sponsor, and we need the goals. We need the goals in their terms, and then we translate them into what that means from a FinOps perspective. A really useful way of doing that is to, well, A, get those goals from the business leaders. I gave some examples of what the questions we might want to ask are. Happy to share more after this session. And then from that, we can start to build a RACI. And a RACI is a document which points out who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. I think I'll just pause a sec. I think there was another question. What position? Oh, is this the same one? I think it may have gone in again. No, it is different. Okay. So what position should the FinOps practitioner play where the goal of the organization is focused towards cloud adoption? Okay. Oh, the second one. Okay, we've got that one. So cloud migration and planning tool in Flexera, is it recommended for service dependency mapping? Is it integrated into Flexera or still require separate access account to be generated? Great question. Yes, it does do the application dependency mapping, service mapping, another term. So that sits as part of Cloud Migration Manager. It does require it's still integrated with the platform. You can reach it through Flexera One, but at the moment it does require a separate logon ID, I believe. I'll check on that one after, and I can come back to you directly. But obviously a great tool, and not only us think so, it's used widely by the industry, whether that's cloud providers or systems integrators or direct customers. So yes, definitely recommend the use of that. I don't know whether that one is going to be rolled in any other way than it currently is to the platform. But like I say, let me take a note of that one, and I will come back to you after the session if you'd like to leave some information somewhere. That would be good. Okay, thank you very much for the question. I appreciate your engagement. So we've built out our RACI, and that is our list of who we're expecting to engage with us, what their responsibilities are, what information we will give them, what information we expect back from them, and what we expect them to do when we're asking them to do something. And that goes for, upwards as well as side to side and down. So it's our peers, our leadership, and maybe our reports. All of those should have a line or a series of lines with content in a RACI document. And it's really important because at some point, somebody will not do something that they're supposed to do. And the impact of that will be us not achieving the optimization that we expect. And it's important not to point fingers, but to understand where that communication or action has broken down and to be able to address it. So really important. So let's assume now that we've connected some tooling, whatever that may be, to the cloud. We've ingested all of that cloud spend through the CUR and billing files. And we've now got good visibility of all of our cloud spend. That might be a single cloud. It might be multiple clouds. And then what we need to do is we need to understand and reconcile those cloud costs. Ideally, we want to be able to normalize that, particularly if we're in a multi-cloud world. So we want to be able to just call compute, whether it's a VM, whether it's an EC2 or compute engine. We want to just call everything the same thing from a compute perspective. Ideally, we want all the storage to be called storage and all of the databases to be called databases. So an element of normalization, and that helps us to understand when we're playing back information to our business users, that they don't have to deal with all of the complexity of multiple clouds giving multiple pieces of information with multiple different taxonomies. We want to try and simplify that as much as possible because it helps us to take actions. And that extends, that visibility and reconciliation extends not just to cloud costs, but also to credits and discount plans. All should be reflected and be able to be displayed and distributed. And then that leads us on to engaging with the business. And typically that engagement comes through show back and charge back. So being able to show back those costs to the business is one step. Whether you want to charge those back as well and give ownership of those costs to those departments is another, and that's purely a business decision. What I will say is when people receive a charge for the cloud consumption, it does sharpen their attention on the activities that need to be taken. And as I said, not all of those activities are taken by the FinOps team. So we've done that. We've been able to show back some of those costs to the business, who's consuming what over what period, and we can expose potential savings to them. So these are the recommendations. Some of them may be provided by the service providers themselves. Others can be delivered to you by your tooling providers. And some may be you can understand from your own analysis of what your environment is and what your business needs are. At that point, there should really be some benefit validation. So you need to understand what it is that you're doing. Should you filter those recommendations, make them more appropriate for the people that are receiving them? Then there may be some cost benefit analysis. So the people who are actually taking those actions, it might seem like a simple cost action from our perspective, but actually there's a great deal of effort required by the owning engineering or service teams. So understanding that is important, and that may be a discussion, and it may be an automated process. Assuming that is successful and you agree that something needs to be done, and so does your actioning body, then you might want to set and document some results that you expect and some KPIs associated with them. Setting those KPIs, you then take the action, and the action is taken, and then you can measure yourself against those KPIs that you've set. And if you want to, you can then add more data points to your analysis Typically, you would then get into things like automating all of this, so workflow integration, ticketing, maybe a chat system so people can ask questions about optimization recommendations that are being made. And where we started, this particular slide was around real-time notifications, or better, notifications in real time, typically associated with anomalies and detection of anomalies, and then action to remediate those anomalies. Benefits from being able to notify in near real time when those things have happened. And from a cloud perspective, this isn't the next minute, like you might have with a security incident. Typically, if it's a reasonable cloud spend, it's going to take some time to export, ingest, and process that. So at best, you are probably looking at a daily notification and being able to take action. Depending on your import schedules, then it may be longer. And as I mentioned, the unit economics piece is kind of the utopia. It brings real visibility of the value to the business. So I won't dwell on that too much because we've spent quite a bit of time talking about that already. And then just a nod to sustainability and it being a cost being a proxy for sustainability. Moving much more away from that now as a proxy, because certainly Microsoft are providing some good, if not particularly clear on the origins of them, data around what CO2 emissions are associated with your cloud consumption. And we expect all of the cloud providers to start delivering reasonably useful information around sustainability and CO2 emissions as we go forward. From a Flexera perspective, we're taking a much broader and holistic view around that, so we can bring in other data sources that we have at our disposal to embellish and bolster those findings to make them more reliable and more meaningful, and potentially more compliant with the regulatory bodies. Okay, how are we doing for time? I think we're okay for a little bit. Please feel free to drop in any more questions. What I want to do now is just move on to a couple of items in here. And because this is the first session, it's really just looking at the first couple of points here. So let's move ourselves on. I talked about RACI. I just wanted to give you a quick example of kind of what that looks like. And I'll just pull out a few little pieces. I'm happy to share this afterwards. You can find it anyway on the FinOps Foundation, a version of it. But what we're looking for is to try and break down all of those areas of responsibility for FinOps. Find a responsible owner, find out somebody who's accountable for it when things go well and they go not so well. Who needs to be consulted? Who might need to provide information to us, or we need to provide information to them? A good example of that would be before an action is taken, we need to consult with a service owner to let them know that something is going to happen to their service. No impact might be expected, but they like to know. So they could be consulted or informed. And these are broken down into quite a lot of detail. As I say, this is kind of public domain information. I'm happy to, share a copy to anybody who would like to use it as a reference point. But it is a really powerful tool. I can't emphasize enough how many customers we speak to who are struggling to make progress with their FinOps initiatives. And it's because the people across the organization do not know their responsibilities. And a RACI document, responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, is a really good way of doing it. There are others as well. So whatever works for you, workbooks and things like that, or work breakdown structures can be useful. For me, they tend to be a little bit detailed and wordy. This is quite succinct. So I think it works well, and it's quite easy for people to find themselves within this structure as well. Okay, so no questions on RACIs. That's great. Okay, not sure what's going on here. Oh, yes, I do know what's going on here. Great. So we're on to the next slide. This is going to be a real test of our webinar technology, because we're going to try and build out a slide here. I tried earlier today and it was only marginally successful. So there are lots of things that we can do in order to try and optimize costs, and which ones are appropriate and which ones will be beneficial is wholly dependent on your organization, what you have deployed, where you have it deployed, and to what level that you have the various things deployed. So I've broken these down in terms of potential savings. And the key word here is potential. I mean, this doesn't mean necessarily that some or even any of it can be realized. But if you look at the numbers in terms of, dollar values of savings, should you take some of these actions, then this gives you some of the percentages. And then the bottom level is really a variable around how much of that, let's say, commitments you utilize. So what I'd like to do, and I'll just see if this slide will build out at all. Okay, it looks like it is. So let's just step through these, because I think it's a worthwhile use of time. So spot instances or preemptible, if you're in Google space, then I think most people are aware of these. They use up effectively spare capacity in the cloud providers. They can be withdrawn at very short notice. So they are only suitable for fault-tolerant workloads or workloads that you can sacrifice. Let's put it that way. Excuse me, something in my eye. But the potential savings are huge. Question from Devendra, thank you again. Do you think native cloud cost management tools have matured enough? What would differentiate tools like Flexera CCO? Well, I think there's a couple of questions there. Let's unpack that one a little bit, because it's a reasonable question. The cloud cost tools are appropriate for some organizations and may not be for others. So for a start, they typically will only present detail for cost and recommendations on their own cloud. I know historically there has been the ability to import some information into AWS, for example. It wasn't particularly successful from my experience, but it was an option. Whether things will change under the focus format, so the FinOps Foundation has created the focus standard for the export and ingest and processing of cost. It was cloud cost, but actually it's an everything cost. At the moment, that's probably not in a position where it's representative enough of all of the features that are available from all of the clouds to really provide a utopia, if you like. And for the same reason, the differential between different cloud providers in terms of the reporting capability and the benefits analysis and the nuances of the billing data mean that it's quite difficult unless you're with a single provider, to have a single tool unless it's a third-party one. So the normalization that I was talking about on previous slides is something that third-party tool, so Flexera CCO, does that normalization. So if you have a need for aggregated spend, and what I would say is that's aggregated spend not just across cloud, but if you want to see things like SaaS spend and perhaps some on-prem costs, perhaps your VMware estate is configured with cost type information, then really you've got no option but to go for either a self-developed tool or a third-party tool. And that's some of the benefits that third-party tools bring, CCO among them, is that you get aggregation of your data spend. Hopefully you get normalization of the data. You get recommendations that go beyond the cloud providers. And I think one area where Flexera particularly differentiates compared with not only the cloud service providers, but other tooling providers is that we give an open box approach. So typically, if you're buying or using a third-party tool or a cloud provider tool, you essentially get a black box. You will get recommendations, but you don't know the detail behind how they're sourced. And it's rare that you're able to manipulate those to suit your environment. There may be some slide bars and things, but the variables are generally quite small. Flexera differentiates itself with the ability for you to see exactly what has made up the numbers for the optimization recommendations that we produce. So if you have a recommendation, you know that it's right and fit for purpose, assuming you've input the right parameters into the recommendations engine. So for me, that would be kind of the main differentiators. And of course, touched on it a bit, but the ability to import any cost and represent it in the platform is quite critical, certainly to people in a multi-cloud world. So thank you for the question. Let me just step through a couple more. Maybe I won't do all of them, but I'll just make a mention of some of the important ones. So reserved instances, and this would be for commitments. So committing to a certain level of usage in exchange for a discount, often over 1 or 3 years. Google will do some things a little bit differently. In addition to kind of commitment-based things, you can have, how much you're using something over a period of time. So there are a few variances by cloud provider, but in essence, it's a great opportunity. Obviously, from the cloud perspective, they're getting a commitment that you're going to use a certain amount of resource for a period of time. That gives them predictability, and they can share that predictability and knowledge that they are going to have a certain amount of revenue in terms of a discount. So a pretty straightforward correlation between that. Next comes instance scheduling. Really back to the point that we were making earlier or discussing earlier in the session around getting ahead of the game and understanding around what the workload is going to be doing, who it's going to be servicing, what options do you have. This is one of the options where the scheduling of those resources can provide fairly significant savings, depending on what that looks like. I mean, if it's just part of a weekend, then you may only have a small amount to save. If it's every evening after 5 until 7 in the morning and all of weekends, then there might be a reasonable amount. Something obviously to consider when you're taking any of those kind of approaches is that the commitments that you've made may well be affected by things like auto-scaling and right-sizing of instances. So all of them have their benefits, but for example, the auto-scaling, you may start to impact some of your other strategies. So really important to take them as a whole. I think we could spend a whole session in future talking about the merits of which comes first and which doesn't, and what considerations happen between all of these. But there are some other ones which I think I would like to mention here. And one of them is the newer instance types. So that's quite important. Let's just step through some of this. Not sure if it's going to work. Okay, it does. Let's see if we can get to the newer instance types. And are we there? Don't know if we're there. Newer instance types or superseded instances can provide significant benefit. There may be some implications of that potentially with your service users, so something to consider carefully. But looking at superseded instances, I mean, for example, GP2 to GP3 on AWS, pretty much no impact to the service, but benefits in terms of performance and cost. So really a no-brainer in many of those instances. We talked a little bit about potential and getting ahead of the game again in terms of the CPU type that might be possible to use. That's dependent on operating systems and things like that, but certainly some reasonably significant savings are possible. And last but not least, on the kind of columns in there, the circular columns, is right sizing of software licenses or hybrid use benefit as well, then there is significant savings there, potentially from right sizing, but also from hybrid benefit, which we should also take into consideration. And to the right hand side, we've got a little bit about tagging and governance and efficiency. So it's not all about straight stuff in the cloud. The resources that you have deployed are one thing, but actually having good cloud hygiene and good governance does help to reduce costs as well. Being able to understand what you have, where it is through a competent and well-executed tagging policy brings enormous benefits in terms of not only tracking costs, but efficiently dealing with resources as well. So take that into consideration. Obviously, having visibility, so FinOps reporting and dashboarding, whether that's from your cloud provider or from a third-party tool or from something you've developed yourself, doesn't really matter. Just that visibility can help your cloud cost optimization. And of course, if you don't feel that you're able to do it yourself, there are plenty of partners out there. Flexera has them too, who can help you on your FinOps journey and provide services to manage some of those things on your behalf. Okay, I'm just going to take a pause for a moment. We are kind of at time right now. So I have a question. And oh, actually, no, we do have a bit more time. We've got an extra 30 minutes, haven't we? So I'm good. I thought I was going way behind schedule, but I'm actually not. So I think we're all good. What I would like to do next is, if I can get this slide to continue to build out, is to go here. And what this is an extension of what we've talked about in terms of the recommendations on the previous slide. And it's kind of working with them. So we've talked around this a little bit, but what I wanted to bring together here was that it's a community effort, and that's community not just in terms of people, but it's a community in terms of sources of data, and it's a community often in terms of who is going to be actioning the recommendations. So when we have the recommendations, so we've got, let's pick on something. It's a right size compute. No, or let's go with idle compute because it's in the picture here. So we've got some idle compute. We know that when we've configured our recommendation, we know that anything below 3% CPU utilization on average for the month is likely to be unutilized. So we've decided that that can be, a snapshot is taken and that machine is shut down. So that would be our recommendation. We've got some sources for that data, and those can come from our cloud service providers. We will receive those in Flexera 1, but it could be any tooling or it could be your own. You might want to enrich that data with information. In our case, we call them policies, but they're pieces of automation that provide extra value and insight into potential recommendations. And then from a kind of people, tools, and process perspective, I've called it a recommendations action engine. It's only an engine in terms of it makes things happen and hopefully makes the whole process move forward. But it is a process, it's not a tool. Although potentially it could be, and it could be a combination of them to deliver this, like ITSM tooling and ticketing and things. But you will get a consolidated series of recommendations, and you need to test those. So they need to be kind of categorized. They need to be delivered to the teams that might be able to take action. And we need a feedback loop. The reason I've got lots of different business units and app owners is quite often responsibility is distributed. And from a FinOps perspective, we want these people to do some of our work for us. A, they're closer to the action, so they can make more informed decisions in many cases. But B, we're generally a small team and we don't have the capacity to take action. And quite often within these teams, there'll be engineering and development and operational personnel that we can make use of. So we submit some recommendations for analysis. Those recommendations are analyzed. We want that feedback loop that comes back into recommendations that are infeasible. They are not practical to implement for one reason or another, or there are recommendations that we just want parked for now. If they don't fall into any of those buckets, then they need to go through the process and have action taken. And to do that, we need to involve some of the teams that we talked about before. So that Cloud Center of Excellence and a collaboration board, whatever you would like to call it, and whoever those teams are that we saw in the slide earlier with the kind of life cycle view, are really important. We need to understand those because us as practitioners are going to start to feed back. If we know that, for instance, we have SAP deployed in our environment and SAP comes with a specific architectural design from the manufacturer, and our recommendations say that the web dispatcher has only been used because it's our idle compute recommendation, less than 5%, and we would like to downsize it or switch it off. We obviously know then, and we'll get feedback from that service owner to go, no, it's a manufacturer recommendation. If we downsize it or switch it off, we'll not have support from SAP should an incident occur. So it must stay as it is. And then the feedback loop would be something like, it's not a feasible recommendation. What we would then do is work with our Cloud Center of Excellence and our engineering teams to apply a tag, an exclusion tag to that resource to say, don't bring it forward into our recommendations again, or not for a period of time. So this kind of method needs to be built into your FinOps process to be able to make sure that your recommendations are useful and acted upon. People don't get duplicate recommendations or repeat recommendations for things that they've already informed us that are not practical to implement. Okay, I don't see any questions right now. So take that as you will. You know, it's really a sum up of the kind of communication that needs to happen between all of the different actors. But thinking of it in terms of what can be progressed, what is not feasible to progress, and what may be parked for a period of time is a good way to try and sort your recommendations into things that can be actioned now, that can be postponed, and probably need to be reviewed, you know, over a period of time, but are not urgent. Okay, I'll just pause a moment again before I move on to the next slide. Actually, no, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is our summary of kind of what works, what typically doesn't. It's not an exhaustive list, of course. It's just some of the things that we see work well, and really it's the things that we've talked about through the session so far. So early executive board engagement and sponsorship, absolutely essential. But, you know, that does need to be tied to realistic and meaningful outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And, you know, an 80% cut in cloud spend, unless it's an 80% cut in production or something, is not a realistic outcome. You know, we need to feed back to executive and board members to give them what the parameters are for an acceptable outcome. Engage early and regularly with stakeholders, get a seat at the table with at least the application owners, the architects and engineering and development teams, and importantly, finance and procurement. At some point, there will be finance on your back trying to understand how they can reconcile an invoice against the costs that they see from the provider. Not an easy task and probably a subject for another session. Remember to feed back in the chat about what you would like to see in future sessions. Otherwise, we'll just pick some themes and see what kind of response we get. So clear definition of your data sources for cost allocation, shared cost and credit distribution. So not just being able to receive all of your costs, but understanding when you get credits, something needs to be done with them. Do you keep them all as the FinOps team to go out for a nice Christmas dinner, or do you share them back across the business? All those decisions and the mechanism to do so needs to be understood. That may be tagging, it may be linkage back to an enterprise architecture tool, it could be related to subscriptions and accounts. Whatever it is, make sure it's documented, make sure it's justifiable, and make sure it's evidenced. Clear accountability for cost, cloud costs and action. So back to the RACI, responsible, accountable, consulted and informed. It really will be important for you to make progress with your actions against your FinOps objectives. Setting the vision, this could arguably be at the top and really should be, but the metrics and being able to communicate the benefits. So actually making everybody aware and getting agreement on what the metrics are. So is it, if you're making commitments, so whether they're reserved instances or savings plans, is a good measure of success how well utilized they are, how much coverage you have, you know, whatever it happens to be, make sure that it's understood and that it's documented. And importantly, if you're taking multiple initiatives, make sure that it's understood that if you, and again, this is a conversation for another session, I think, but if you're making commitments first and then making right-sizing recommendations or right-sizing, those right-sizing actions may impact your commitment performance. May not, but they may. So, you know, understanding the interaction between your initiatives is really important as well, and important to have that documented, at least at a high level. Be inclusive, of course, it goes to the reaching out to all of those people, but finance, procurement, architecture, engineering, application and business owners, they all have something to add. As frustrating as it can be when you have a clear opportunity and nobody wants to take ownership of it, being able to talk to the people, preferably in their language, not just in FinOps terms, is really important. And of course, need to understand that the burden of proof, particularly with engineering teams or DevOps teams, is going to be higher. The people who are responsible for operating that production environment will really need some proof that the change they're going to make, A, isn't going to impact service, and B, is going to be better for them, really. So no impact or low impact, but at least known, and what's in it for them. And it was mentioned at a FinOps meetup a little while ago, but a term that was used, I think it was the Just Eat team, used getter, which was getting engineers to take action. It was changed a little bit by others to getting everyone to take action. And what they found was that putting a load of potential cost savings on the plate of the engineering team made absolutely no difference to their approach and their enthusiasm to make changes to their infrastructure. What did make a difference was when they put an ESG, you know, a CO2 lens on it, and said, by making these changes, by reducing the CPU usage or changing to a different processor, we will save this many kilograms of CO2. And actually, it turned out that they were quite interested in environmental issues and took the action based on CO2 emissions rather than cost. So know your audience as well, and what might be a good lever for them to start doing some work. Okay, so what I would like to do, let's just go through the last couple, because there are a few bits that I did want to touch on around KPIs and things. So visibility tailored to the customer's needs. If you've built your ingested your costs and you have good visibility, most people will not want to look at everything. So make sure your dashboarding and your information and updates and reporting is tailored to the user. An executive or a finance person will have different needs to an engineer who's investigating a particular cost anomaly. And just to go right back to the beginning, cost is typically the start point. but ensure the conversation moves to value drivers. So what does saving the money mean to the business? Does it mean that you can accelerate a project? Does it mean that you've gained greater compliance? Can that cost control initiate another project, for example? So bear that in mind. Definitely things to avoid. Dictates and mandates, unless they're supported by an executive. Presenting benefits without business context rarely gets people motivated. And talking FinOps. I know I have been all through this session, but talk about desired outcomes. So the desired outcome is something that we just mentioned there. Is there a project that needs to be accelerated? If you can show that you can reduce cost and you're doing a migration to cloud, but an inhibitor is the potential cloud cost is high, is that because the infrastructure it's being deployed on is not cloud ready? Should it be re-architected before it gets migrated into cloud? And that would save costs and enable your migration plan to be accelerated. So some of the things that are quite important from a general FinOps perspective. Okay, I've been asked to wrap up. There were just a few more things. I'll just pick, I'm just going to whiz forward really, because this was to do with KPIs, really important, and I don't necessarily want to dwell, and it's quite a wordy chart, but it is important to consider KPIs. They generally fall into 4 broad areas: visibility, optimization, governance, and business integration. I will let you consume those at your leisure. What there is behind many of these, the FinOps Foundation has a whole KPI working group. I was part of that. They have delivered some really useful content, which is available on finops.org. Just search on there for KPIs. And it gives you the metrics and the measurement and the formula to generate some meaningful KPIs. What is important to note is that a balanced view of KPIs is important. Start small, just pick 1 or 2 to start with, and then start building them out. And they don't all have to be straight cost ones. It could be something like the number of untagged resources up in the top left-hand corner there. It could be something to do with education and trained. Are the people that are involved with your FinOps program, wherever they live, do they have at least a basic comprehension of FinOps, the benefits and the outcomes that are typical?